Well, that's the thesis of the new book From Nowhere that's going to come out in a few months. And admittedly, it's a bold thesis, and that's kind of what I like to do. Is I like to try to take the boldest formulation of an idea and throw it to the wall and see if it sticks, and see how well it sticks, and see what pushback I get. I don't know if is is inspiration equal to precognition? I don't know. And I don't know that you could ever prove that. And I think a lot of artists, even if they were inspired by that basic idea, would find it reductive to say, well, it's only precognition. And that's not exactly what I mean. But yes, I think that there's here, one piece of evidence for this is the way that psychic information is described by people is identical. The way psychics describe receiving information, or the way mediums describe getting information that's, they experience it as coming from outside. Okay. They experience it as not, in remote viewing, for instance, remote viewers learn to distinguish thoughts that feel self-generated from those that just truly feel spontaneous and external to them, and realize that those external feeling thoughts are the ones where the psychic value is. Well, that's exactly the way inspiration has always been described by artists. That it's, it comes from nowhere. They can't account for where it came from.
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here, speaking as your host. And before we get into it here in our next conversation with Eric, I just want to remind the listener, please subscribe, share with your family and friends. Again, this is how we have been growing over the last 3.5 years. And this is the best way to grow with people who love listening in and accompanying us on this journey and learning the way we are, which is actually quite humbling, to tell you the truth. So thank you for your auditory companionship. If you feel so inclined as well, our regular listener knows we are a not-for-profit, also a charity. You can go to our website, behindgreatness.org, and you can see where you can give if you like. And while you're there, just explore our ever-expanding content library, conversations that we've been having with people all over the world. And we are adding to it yet again with today's conversation. So today we're joined by, so you're in DC, right, Eric?
I'm just outside of DC. I used to live in DC, and then I moved to Fairfax
Fairfax.
Outside the Beltway.
You did tell me. I was in my notes. Okay, so Fairfax. So that voice belongs to Eric Wargo. Eric Wargo has a PhD in anthropology from Emory University and works as a professional science writer and editor in Washington, D.C. He is the author of Time Loops in 2018, Precognitive Dream Work and the Long Self in 2021, and a forthcoming From Nowhere, Artists, Writers, and Precognitive Imagination. In his spare time, Eric writes about science fiction, consciousness, and parapsychology at his popular blog, The Nightshirt. And you can reach that at thenightshirt.com, and all the interesting stuff that he's been writing about for several years. And we'd like to thank also Jeffrey Kripal, who's been on the show and urged us to reach out to Eric. And then we saw Eric's name again as a testimonial on Diana Pasulka's second book, Encounters. And we said, okay, this is the sign. Maybe it's a precognitive sign. I don't know. We'll try and explore that. Welcome to the program, Eric.
Thanks for having me, Luciano.
Before we get into everything else, why Nightshirt? Why is your blog called Nightshirt?
It's just from an old dream I had that I don't know. I was thinking of it when I started my blog back in, 2007 or something like that. And then I used a piece of that dream as a quote, like on the top of my blog originally. But it's, I don't know, it sort of evokes, dreams and getting up late at night and wandering the house and exploring mysterious things. So it kind of stuck, and I kind of like it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. And you mentioned 2007. That's like prehistory. That's the year that the iPhone
Yeah.
came out.
Well, right,
Uh,
right. I maybe 2008, something like that. Yeah.
okay, so 1 year after prehistory. It's like it's almost our AD. It's our modern AD,
Right.
2007.
Right.
Um, okay, so there are various reasons why we were interested in speaking to you. And then after you and I chatted, I got more curious about your thoughts on precognition. Just recently, we had another guest on, Stephen Eisenstadt. I may have mentioned him to you before, but he's out in Santa Barbara, and he's been working on dreams and imagination. It's called the Imagination Matrix, I think was his last book, and we talked extensively about his work on dreams and the dream landscape. And he said something very interesting right in the middle of the talk, and maybe this is I'll use this as a prompt to get your thoughts. He said, amongst other things, he said dreams represent the ongoingness of the conversation. What does that mean to you, if anything?
The ongoingness of the conversation, meaning the conversation between oneself and oneself. Is that what he means?
Let's leave it there. I want to get your thoughts on those four words.
Well, I like the word ongoingness. I don't know what Eisenstadt means by that, but the title of my second book on dreams, Precognitive Dream Work on the Long Self, that long self idea is really important to me, and it's what comes through in the study of precognition. Um, because I mean, this is an idea that really goes back to Einstein, which is, it was his discoveries that sort of solidified this notion that we live in a four-dimensional universe, a four-dimensional space-time, and that time dimension, we have a hard time perceiving it or understanding it, but it's there. And we are really, we look at ourselves and we feel like we're three-dimensional, but we're in fact four-dimensional. We're extending through time. And it's not something that we are readily conscious of, but when you study um, precognition and you begin to see how, for instance, you are nightly perhaps having dreams about events that essentially already exist in your future, it reinforces this sense that we are like these uh, world lines is what physicists call it. We extend through time. And the long self is this idea of us as four-dimensional creatures, not three-dimensional creatures, and that we are uh, constantly interacting with ourself across time. Now, the idea that we interact with our past in the form of memory and so forth, that's taken for granted. But I and other people who study precognition think that, in fact, memory goes in both directions. And so we have this, just as we have an already existing past, we have an already existing future. And dreams and all kinds of other experiences, synchronicities, and art, creativity link us to our future. And the more you have precognitive experiences consciously, the more that sense of ourselves as a four-dimensional entity is reinforced, and it's profoundly profound. It's a very mind-blowing kind of realization to realize that we have a future and it's speaking to us in kinds of indirect and symbolic ways. So in terms of the ongoingness of the conversation, I suppose that's one way of looking at that phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have asked you that right at the beginning, because you you gave me a truckload full of stuff to for us to parse out a bit, because like I said at the beginning, it's very fascinating to think of dreams and to think of our existence as something different than what we perceive. So that, I mean, that's why we have a lot of guests that we do also on the podcast. But I want to read something very, very quickly from your book. So from your Precognitive Dream Work and the Long Self. So this is page 175. and you talked about the brain as an organ that pulls conscious thoughts and insights from a more informed future. And you said the brain, and I suspect smaller cellular units and cells themselves, thinks across its history, not just in the instant. It means your conscious thought processes right now, along with a fan of many other conscious moments, are the unconscious of you a few seconds ago, a few minutes ago, a few hours ago, and even a few weeks or years ago. So I read that. Fine. I get it. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. It's the culmination of what's been happening up to the present moment. And then you said I like the way you said this, stated differently, instead of also, but, or however. You said stated differently. And then you said your future consciousness is the unconscious of your present moment, quietly animating and informing your thoughts and actions, maybe causing a slip of the tongue, or if you're sleeping, a dream, or giving you some intuition or hunch of where to go and how to proceed, and perhaps generating a precognitive vision of something you will encounter tomorrow, or creating some other kind of uncanny synchronicity. So it goes on, but I won't. This implies that the future maybe doesn't exist. It's always happening, and we're getting pings or reminders that it's always happening.
I don't know what you mean by doesn't exist. I mean, I'm saying it does exist. It just not yet, but it's there in this kind of four-dimensional block space-time is what it's sometimes called in physics. And because it's there, it can interact causally with the present moment, the same way the already existing past can interact causally with the present moment in various ways. I'm glad you picked that quote because it sort of highlights the kind of basic idea that I've been arguing in both of my first two books, and that I am continuing to argue in my next book, which is that the unconscious, this term that we associate with Sigmund Freud, really is kind of essentially our future consciousness acting back upon us in the present, and influencing us, and doing so in all the ways that Freud identified in his study of the unconscious. I think it's really important. Freud people think of Freud as, oh, wasn't he debunked or whatever? People think he's somehow no longer relevant. Freud, I think, is very, very important in this because even though ironically he did not believe in precognition, his what's sometimes called his metapsychology, that is to say his sort of iceberg model of the conscious self or conscious mind up above, the tip of the iceberg, and then the unconscious stuff underneath, I think is a ready-made model for understanding precognition. And all we have to do is turn the iceberg on its side and think of it laying flat along the sort of x-axis of time, and think of that submerged part of the iceberg as what's ahead of us in the future and influencing us in all the ways that Freud identified. Dreams, that was his first sort of breakthrough book, was the interpretation of dreams, but then his next one was the psychopathology of everyday life. So he's talking about slips of the tongue and what Carl Jung would later call synchronicities, and all kinds of little mishaps and accidents and things like that. And then he developed the theory further into talking about jokes and humor and creativity and neurotic symptoms and so on. All of these are ways in which our future life is influencing us in the present. And so again, just turning that iceberg on the side, I think it really illuminates all the ways precognition works. And so I think of his theory as kind of a ready-made theory of precognition. We just have to tweak it a little bit, flip it a little bit.
So when I asked you about dreaming, you said that you've been a dreamer all your life, and that you've recorded your dreams for decades. That's an exercise I've been doing semi-actively, maybe in the last 3 years or so, because I find it a lot of fun reading what I was dreaming a year ago or 6 months ago, sometimes I visit them or I revisit and I see things that
Yeah.
might appear to have been precognitive,
Mhm.
which is fun. But you said precognition was never part of your lexicon when you were doing this for I don't know how many decades or so forth. What was it? What was the turning point for you? When is it that you realize that maybe there's something there about precognition?
Yeah. So I was sort of steeped in, well, first of all, my parents were psychologists, and although they weren't that interested in dreams, there were books about dreams on their bookshelves, and so even when I was a teenager, I was interested in dreams, and that always fascinated me. And then in graduate school, one of my professors was actually a psychoanalyst, and I got very steeped in Freudian theory, and then from there went into Jacques Lacan and other psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic theory. So I've always been interested in that. So for since I would say the early 90s, I've been recording my dreams, and I was an early adopter of laptop computers. I had an early, clunky laptop, and I used it to keep an electronic dream journal essentially. And in fact, my oldest dream journals I can't even access anymore because they're in Word
That's right.
Perfect, which is a
Yeah, you
program
told
that
me.
doesn't exist anymore. And I wouldn't know
So
how to
nine,
even get these things.
so
I know.
1994.
So right,
Hmm.
but anyway, so I originally had a sort of Freudian approach to interpreting my dreams, and then as I got older, a little more spiritual, and metaphysical, I got interested in Jung, and I've sort of run the gamut of different approaches to dream work. But it wasn't until really late, like 2009, 2010, that I got interested in precognition and precognitive dreaming. I'll tell you, sort of one of the turning points was I had a UFO sighting in 2009. It wasn't anything up close and personal and super weird or anything like that, but it was enough to get me interested in the subject of ufology. And if you go down the rabbit hole of ufology at all, you encounter this idea that psychic phenomena are intrinsically linked to UFO encounters.
Mhm.
And at that time, I was a scientifically trained person. I I didn't have any problem with UFOs at all. I was fascinated, but I did have a definite knee jerk rejection of ESP. Okay, I thought I was sort of brought up with this idea that ESP is pseudoscience, and I just had no belief in that. But again, you start going down the rabbit hole of ufology and you realize, well, very smart people, people like Jacques Vallée and so on, uh, are talking about these really compelling psychic phenomena that occur in the uh, aura of UFO encounters and so on. So it forced me to kind of do my due diligence and kind of read more about the topic and learn more. And that was a big um, paradigm shift for me. I mean, actually, UFOs weren't such a paradigm shift. I had no problem with the idea of UFOs, but I did have, a real problem with the idea of ESP and psychic phenomena. And around that time, I think in 2011, I was working as editorial director at a big scientific psychology organization in Washington, D.C. And a article came across my desk, and this was an article from our sort of rival psychology organization publisher, and but this was an article by an eminent Cornell psychologist named Daryl Bem, who who had conducted this very large series of precognition experiments, uh, and was publishing it in this very high prestige psychology journal,
Mm.
and it was really troubling to a lot of people in the field. Psychologists are incredibly hostile to the idea of ESP. I say scientific psychologists are hostile, not clinical psychologists so much, but scientific psychologists, like the people I worked with, were really hostile. And they were thinking of writing a letter saying this, shouldn't never be published. This is, makes the field look bad and so on. But this finding or these findings by Daryl Bem were really mind-blowing and and weird, and it sort of reinforced for me what I was reading in the ufology literature, that okay, wait, there's something going on here, and I need to learn more about it. And so yeah, I went down, really honestly, the I kind of got sick of UFOs pretty quickly because it's such a quagmire
Yeah.
of 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 deception
Yes.
and craziness and and whatever. But the ESP literature really gripped me, uh, and and at that time, I took a new look at my own dreams, and realized, oh, you know what? I have had dreams that played out the next day, and I just swept them under the rug. I had a 9/11 dream, as I wrote, in my precognitive dream work book. Um, and it's like, okay, so it forced a kind of paradigm shift in my own thinking about about the reality of ESP, and also the way it was playing out in my own life. And I started paying attention to my dreams in this new way.
Mm.
And that was, really life changing to do that.
So you mentioned in your mentioning of UFO and the apparent tie-in to psychological effects or psychic effects. We had on a retired Navy official, Kevin Day, and Kevin Day was on one of the ships out on the coast of California that witnessed those Tic Tacs.
Tic Tacs, yeah.
Yeah, but he witnessed hundreds, not the one that we saw in a video. Although he was there in the sea when that was happening, that video was taken. It changed him, and one of the main things that changed in his life is he said he just became much more intuitive and creative. He's an emotional guy, and if you ever listen to, if our listeners ever listen to that episode, you can see that he's an emotional guy. But there is something very real about his recounting of it and how it affected him. And
Yeah.
and then we talked to Rudy Shield. Sorry, there's three people that we talked to. So 'cause I want to feed into this conversation too, from some of the points I'm making. And Rudy Shield was just very recently on the podcast, and he's an astrophysicist, very, very renowned astrophysicist. Also part of the Free Foundation with Edgar Mitchell, Ray Hernandez, and Mary Rodwell. And he refers often to the study, that scientific study that Free conducted, I'll get the dates wrong, but between 2013 and like 2019, so over a period of 5-6 years, where they collected thousands of respondents' data on, and I don't know how long the surveys were, but the surveys conducted also measured or also tried to capture people's change in life or people's change to more creative thought, people's turn to creativity as a main focus to their lives after having one of these experiences. And then I asked, and so to go back into the past, an earlier podcast that we had, I asked somebody who had a sighting. I asked him, and he wasn't very comfortable sharing it, so we didn't. But I don't know why, I asked him, after you had these sightings, did your dreams change at all? And he hesitated. He didn't want to answer. So we gave it all the respect. But I thought, like, why did I ask that question? And then why is it that there was an uncomfort or discomfort in answering it? Why? Well, actually, why don't we do this? Why don't we hypothesize? Why do you think there was a discomfort in sharing how dreams change after a sighting?
Well, I can't speak for that person, but
Hypothesize.
um, it's yes, this is very common in the literature, and the so yeah, I thought about this a lot, and I even sort of write about it a little bit in my new book. My new book isn't really about UFOs, but it certainly tangents this question in all kinds of ways, because people who are interested in UFO encounters these days, Diana Pasulka being an example, are very interested in its connection to creativity, and a lot of UFO experiencers uh, receive what they feel like are downloads from alien beings or from whatever they've encountered. And it's also the case, like you described, that after one of these encounters, it opens people, psychically and creatively.
Mm.
So this is an extremely common pattern. And again, it's one that Jacques Vallée sort of identified in his work in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about it, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think um, the most intuitive way of understanding it, the way I know a lot of experiencers understand it, is that somehow it's something from, you know, something from the non-human intelligence or whatever that they've encountered that has changed them. And certainly that's possible. I know that in my case, I can only speak for myself here, but I know that in my case, there was nothing, the object I saw was far away. There was no, it was exciting and interesting, and I tried to film it. It didn't come out on film, but it fired me up because this was weird. This was weird. And like it, I feel like all my life I'd had UFO dreams all my life. And I feel like all my life I'd waited for this opportunity to see one,
Mm-hmm.
And afterwards, and especially after reporting it, I reported to MUFON and and stuff. And I found out that a lot of other people saw the same thing in the same part of the country. It got me to read, essentially it led me down a new intellectual path that was very exciting and very inspiring. Okay. And in fact, I started painting. I started painting UFOs, and I
Hmm.
started doing all this stuff. Like, almost you could compare it to what happens in Close Encounters. Roy Neary, sees the UFO, and then he starts doing sculpture and trying to wrap his head around this thing. And you imagine that, well, he got some sort of telepathic download from the UFO, but you can also look at it in a little bit more of a mundane way and say, well, it's just simply life-changing. And any life-changing experience will make a person more creative, right? I mean, this is basic Carl Jung, you fall in love, it makes you creative, or you
Hmm.
or you have a traumatic experience, it makes you creative. It opens you. So is there something paranormal about the relationship between UFOs and creativity, or is it something biographical, simply biographical, that this is a turning point in my understanding of the world, and it opens my curiosity, it opens my self in all kinds of ways. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like there's a a possibility that there's nothing paranormal about this, that this is just a very, it's about human psychology and our, ability to be busted open
Hmm.
by a life-changing experience of whatever kind. It doesn't need to be a UFO. It could be, meeting a great person and falling in love with them, or again, a traumatic experience, a profoundly traumatic experience. So I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think that there are more possibilities here that to be considered.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
You use the word inspired. You were inspired when you saw that, and in the last conversation we had, you said, and admittedly, you said you can't prove it yet, but you think that inspiration equals precognition.
Well, that's the thesis of the new book From Nowhere that's going to come out in a few months. And admittedly, it's a bold thesis, and that's kind of what I like to do is I like to try to take the boldest formulation of an idea and throw it to the wall and see if it sticks and see how well it sticks and see what pushback I get. um I don't know if is is it is inspiration equal to precognition. I don't know, and I don't know that you could ever prove that. And I think a lot of artists, even if they were inspired by that basic idea, would find it reductive to say, well, it's only precognition, and that's not exactly what I mean. But Yes, I think that that there's well, here one piece of evidence for this is uh, the way that psychic information is described by people is identical. The way psychics describe receiving information, or the way mediums describe getting information that's, they experience it as coming from outside. Okay. They experience it as not, in remote viewing, for instance, remote viewers learn to distinguish thoughts that feel self-generated from those that just truly feel spontaneous, and external to them, and realize that those external feeling thoughts are the ones where the psychic value is. um, well, that's exactly the way inspiration has always been described by artists. That it comes from nowhere. They can't account for where it came from. And so we have all these idioms going back through history of, well, it comes from the muses, or from your demon, or from the gods, or from the spirits, or from the Lord, whatever. There are all kinds of idioms to describe these out of nowhere feeling ideas, um, that come into our heads, or come into our bodies, whatever. Uh, so that similarity between the sort of phenomenology
Hmm.
of psychic experience and inspiration is just one, I think, important piece of the puzzle. It's not the only piece, but it's an interesting, thing that they are experienced the same way. And then you have countless artworks, pieces of literature, and so on that predict, that seem to predict events, either in history, or more commonly predict events and experiences in the artist's own life. And just the same way dreams do. One of the things uh, that I argued in my dream book was, dreams are about our own personal experiences, our own profound learning experiences, our own just upheavals in our life. Even if they're objectively trivial things, they cause an upheaval in our own lives. And so artworks, what I'm showing in the book is that in artists' lives, their works often predict these kinds of upheavals in their own lives. ESP books are full of stories about novels predicting the Titanic disaster and things like that. And there's a million of those. But I think taking a really close biographical approach to artists and their works, that's what I'm trying to do in this book, and show so many cases that no one has ever considered, you know, uh, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway as being a precognitive book, but it was, and or films by Werner Herzog, or David Lynch's Eraserhead, but I show that no, these were precognitive, and uh, and so that's yeah, that's the idea. Precognition is inspiration. Yeah.
That is also interesting because you used also a few minutes ago the word being broken open, that
Hmm.
having a traumatic event would break you open, and that I'm paraphrasing what you said, but I'm interpreting it, would necessarily mean that you would be more creative, or your creative output would increase. But that's also interesting when you say broken open, because any purported medium or psychic would already, in a sense, be broken open. They're already in a broken open state. If they're piercing the veil, then that means that they've at least broken something to access. And that's interesting because when you say inspiration, so I'll say it this way: when I feel inspired about what somebody says to me, or what somebody or some by somebody's actions, or by somebody's ideas, I feel like it awakens something. So it maybe awakens something that needed to be broken open, because that's where it already is. So it's, maybe in a sense it's already in my future, and I get, and it's a reminder. The feeling of being inspired, is a reminder that this has already happened in the future, or that this is the future. I mean, I'm probably saying what you're saying, but I'm just trying to put those terms.
Well, that's one way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. And broken open, yeah, that's an interesting phrase. I mean, a lot of psychics are broken open
mm,
by trauma, honestly. I mean, a history of severe trauma in childhood or early life is very, very, very common in the lives of psychics, shamans,
sure,
um,
sure,
and artists. It's people, who are receptive to, uh, and often and very often it goes along with some degree of mental illness, and suffering. I mean, this is not a good thing. It's not a good thing.
no,
And Jeff Kripal talks about this. I mean, calls it the traumatic secret. I mean, when he has a long history of engaging with people who've had paranormal experiences of one kind or another,
mm,
and he's got to the point where he can tell what's coming. They describe the paranormal experience, and then eventually it comes around to their own trauma that opened them in some way to this or preceded it. And so, yeah, I mean, it's that breaking open is certainly you can describe it as a kind of trauma. And honestly, you know, any kind of life change is a trauma is a minor trauma in that it if it somehow makes your current worldview impossible, that's painful, and requires a small ego death, at least on some level. So you could use a trauma model to think about this, I think, pretty across the board.
why is it that we exist in a state where a broken openness needs to happen? Why is it that there is a veil? Like, what the hell is that? So, I, I asked you at the beginning, future, like there's no future. Well, if we understand it, so maybe this is two questions. So maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Why don't we just do that? Let's talk about that. Why is it that the veil even exists?
I don't think in terms of veils. I think that's a kind of theosophical metaphor that I don't. I mean, a lot of people think in that term that there's a barrier and then we break through a barrier. That's okay, but I think you're keying in on, I think, the really interesting question is, why is there this connection between trauma and inspiration, if you want to put it that way? Is
Sure.
that what you're
Yeah.
asking?
Yeah. Let's take that.
Yeah. Okay. So I have an idea about this, and this is, and I get it. I touch on it in both of my first two books, but I really try to state it more explicitly or more clearly in the forthcoming book, From Nowhere. I think that precognition ultimately operates. There's a basic message in many, well, I can't say all, but many precognitive experiences. And that basic core message is, but I survived.
Hmm.
But I survived. Now, that can mean that, and it's easiest to think of that in terms of, having a dream about, 9/11 or the Titanic disaster, or whatever. These are powerful experiences. Why are they powerful experiences? It's not because we are sadists and like seeing bad things happen to other people, but there is a way in which our kind of, call it our lizard brain, survival oriented, deep, primitive unconscious keys in on a signal from our future that says, oh, this bad thing happened, but I survived. I'm here. I'm still here. Okay. And you can find this if you sort of parse a lot of precognitive premonitory dreams. I apply this model to, Samuel Clemens' famous dream of his brother dying on the riverboat, things like that. There's a way in which you can look at many precognitive experiences, and including minor, precognitive dreams about the sink backing up, which is an example from my book. You know, even that, it's, but I survived. It's like this kind of really troubling thing happened, or this pain in the ass happened, whatever, but I'm still here. I survived. That is, I think, at the root. I think that's the root message in many precognitive, if not all precognitive experiences. And that points to a Darwinian rationale for precognition, operating on any level, whether it be human beings or on planarian worms or anything. I think that this kind of connection to the organism's future and its future survival, I think this is very basic. I think it goes back to the beginning of life. Okay. And and it makes sense that so many precognitive experiences would be about bad things happening, but still being standing at the end of it, even though, oh wow, that was close.
Yeah.
Close calls of one form or another are very common in the precognitive dream literature.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense if you bring an evolutionary thinking to this. Why would this have evolved? Why would organisms have these abilities? Well, obviously it's related to our survival in some way. And I think it's the long self. It's
The long
connecting.
self.
We are
Yeah.
connecting to our future surviving self. It's a trauma to see, bad things happen, that could have happened to me, that thinking, oh gosh, that almost happened to me. That could have happened to me. It's going to happen to me. That's the kind of thought process, and that's traumatic. So
That's so interesting, being tied to survival. We're gonna have on the podcast a remote viewer, another remote viewer. We've had a few, and he was one of the preeminent ones in the 70s and 80s. But he was postulating, or he postulates, he's just shared it with me, that the early human being was much more psychically tapped in than the modern human being for the purpose of surviving. She needed to understand where all the danger points were, and could see psychically where all the danger points were before they entered that space physically. But yeah, just to kind of wrap up that part of the conversation where we talk about survival, there in your book you gave a succinct. Well, there you go. I say succinct, and you have Joe McMoneagle on that page, and that's who I was referring to as that the remote viewer. That's awesome. That's awesome. That is awesome. Was that precognition? Holy smokes!
yeah,
Well, so here I am, like I'm at your page here, but I didn't intend at all to read that. Julia Mossbridge, who's a neuroscientist, and her story about yelling at her 13-year-old for leaving the garage door open, parking his bike, and her child said, "No, that wasn't me." She went out and saw the garage door closed, but when she was out there, she saw an oxygen tank that belonged to her ill husband that was on the verge of exploding and possibly creating lots of damage to the house. And you said, um, you described the context of premonitions. They are the reflux of our future conscious emotions and thoughts about survival. So that's I thought it wrapped that. Thank you for sharing that, because that's something that I actually just read this morning. That page. Survival, inspiration, survival. This is very, very interesting. Let's go back to the dreamscape. So the last conversation we had about dreams, Stephen was talking about how the dreamscape is also it might also be the dreamer, that we might not be the dreamer of the dream, that we might be involved in a greater consciousness providing what it is that we're seeing, what it is that we're experiencing. Do you believe that maybe when we dream, it might not necessarily be the dream that belongs to us, that we're connected with, I don't know, planet Earth or other human beings that are in this dreamscape and creating what it is that we're existing in?
well, that's the common belief, and that's the common. I think that's an ages old um, presumption about dreams. so cultures all over the world, there's the belief that in our dreams there's a detachable spirit that
Hmm.
roams the world in our dreams, and that our dreams reflect that kind of thing. But also the idea that in a you know people who take ayahuasca, talk about, being in a common shared
Hmm.
kind of spiritual landscape and so on.
Okay.
So that's a very, common idea. And I would not want to speak against that. My approach looks at the dream as the self, but that four-dimensional landscape of the self, which
Hmm.
is vast. I mean, you know, a lifetime, an average lifetime contains, countless experiences over the course of, decades. And it's a vast, it's a vast landscape. And we, travel that landscape. I look upon the dream as essentially that whole landscape, you know, events across that whole landscape are being kind of refracted into this, into a single kind of tableau,
Hmm.
you know, of the dream. And it has to be symbolic and transformed and distorted. You can't, there's no way you could have a crystal clear, video quality vision of your whole life. How could you do that? That's like, so it has to be reduced, and symbolic and transformed and transfigured. And so, that's another way of looking at dream symbolism, and, that it's a kind of transfiguration of this huge four-dimensional landscape of the self, the long self. So that's the way I look at it.
Have you ever had a precognitive dream of your death?
I have, well, there's no way of knowing if it's of my death or not until my death has. So I don't know. I mean, I do not accept any claim of a precognitive dream until the precognitive event comes to pass. People say, "Oh, I had this dream about blah blah blah." Is that precognitive? Well, I don't know. You have to you have to wait and see.
Fair,
You
fair,
know,
of course.
um,
That's how you can
uh,
prove it's
so
precognitive, yeah, of course.
right, right, and this is one thing that I think scares a lot of people off of the topic is, yeah, you'll have a precognitive dream that's about something terrible, or something terrible happening to yourself or to your kids or something like that. It's like, but the thing is most dreams are symbolic, or they're about our future thoughts.
Hmm.
Dreams are about our future thoughts about experiences, not direct
Hmm.
experiences most of the time. So again, we're liable to have dreams about something terrible happening that in fact we wind up averting, or wind up, it doesn't happen, but we have this thought in the aftermath that, oh, that could have happened. That was a close call.
A close friend of mine came to visit us, or came by to visit us about a month ago, and he just shared a dream that he had. It was very weird, uh, and he said, I dreamt that I was on a plane and was crashing, but it was very weird because it was Alaska Airlines. And I said, why? Do you remember Alaska? He goes, yeah, Alaska Airlines. Like, how the hell, like Alaska Airlines? I said, so did it crash? I said, did it crash? He goes, no, no, no. I got out of that dream before any crash happened. I stopped the crash. He
Wow.
said, I stopped the crash. And then what happened a few days later was that issue with
Right.
Alaska Airlines. And so he texts me, he goes, are you kidding me? So,
Yeah,
uh,
sure.
yeah.
Yep.
Well,
Yep.
and there were,
That's the way it works.
that's the way it
Yeah.
works.
I mean, dreams are never like exactly what happens. I mean, but it's your thought about what could have happened,
Hmm.
or what, it's often a worst case scenario about something real that did happen, but wasn't quite the same.
But see, he wasn't on the plane.
Yeah.
He wasn't in reality, in his 3D reality. He wasn't on that plane. It wasn't his personal experience.
We always do this. The dream puts you in the thick of the action. So, I have like a million dreams about, like, okay, I engage with Twitter every morning. I shouldn't, it's bad for my mental health. But, I get
Yes.
on Twitter first thing in the morning, and I'm, engaging with Twitter. And so and my precognitive dreams, usually are about something I'm reading on Twitter, or some picture, some weird picture or video that's just very distinctively weird or interesting on Twitter. But in the dream, I will have been in that scene, and get, I will have been part of it. You don't dream about yourself looking at the newspaper, but most dreams are about your engagement with the news, or about your engagement with media over the next few days. Um, and your dream will always put you in the thick of the action, and it will always be more dramatic than the actual thing is. Um, it'll It's part of it's partly dreams, very mundanely are part of the way that our brain makes new memories. Okay. And my argument is that, well, it's making memories of the future as well as the past. But, uh, part of the way memory works is by dramatizing, by making things dramatic and exciting.
That's how you remember them,
Uh,
if they're dramatic.
that's how you remember them.
Yeah.
So dreams are doing that. They are making things as vivid and exciting and dangerous and perilous as they can, even if it's subjective, even if you're dreaming about is something, really
But those, again,
boring. Like,
well, those are the dreams we remember because they're dramatic. I mean, everybody dreams all the time. The ones that we remember are the ones that incite
I
something.
think they're all I mean, most dreams are probably pretty dramatic. We forget them for different reasons. The dreams are not meant to stick in memory. And that's the kind of the irony of dreams, is that they are about making memories, but they themselves are not super memorable. And we are dreaming throughout the night, and at best we will remember, maybe one or two dreams or dream scenes from a whole night of dream experiences that are gone forever from our conscious memory. Yeah, I mean, we remembered a tiny fraction.
I just want to return back to remote viewing just for a moment, because by the time this episode airs, we will have had Paul Smith on the podcast. We already recorded with him. And Paul was the trainer, one of the main trainers for a number of years in the Stargate program. He explained to us, or he described to us, a couple of stories that were remarkable for him. And one of them was remote viewing projectiles into the water, hitting a particular style of ship 50 hours
The
before.
Stark incident.
Yeah, USS Stark. Yeah, okay, well, that was, of course, a USS Stark incident. And 50 hours later, that in fact happened. And very close to the illustration that he drafted after he remote viewed it. Again, that's not a dream, and again, he's not part of that. He wasn't part of that action.
Well, precognition manifests in all kinds of ways, and psychics learn to access it readily in waking states, and people who are prone to hallucination and voice hearing and stuff like that, they experience it in waking states very readily, and we all experience it in the form of synchronicities. Synchronicities are just precognition, by another name, and or inspiration, and some random thought comes into your head, write it down, because it might actually correspond to something that's about to happen in your life. We just don't pay attention. That's the thing. I mean, we're experiencing precognition all the time, but not consciously, because it's only recently that this concept has even emerged in our culture, and most people have never heard of precognition. So, we're not conscious of it. But yes, I mean, remote viewers are very, they are trained, they've trained themselves to access that information. Now, there's a big debate in the remote viewing world about, is remote viewing anything other than precognition? That is to say, the mental model that most remote viewers are working with is that their consciousness or some faculty is reaching across space, okay, and seeing something at a distance. There may be no way to distinguish such an idea because how do you know what you've seen is right until you get feedback, until you see, until the truth is revealed and you know that you were right. Well, how do you know that you're not simply precognizing that revelation of reality? Now, I am I'm not a remote viewer, and I this is a big thorny question in and a lot of remote viewers really hate this idea, but I suggest that maybe it's all precognition, that remote viewers are precognizing feedback, precognizing things they will learn in their future. That may be part of it, may be built into an experiment where you remote view what's in an envelope, and then the envelope is revealed, and sure enough, there's what you saw, and you precognize that exciting moment of getting that feedback. Or you precognize some feedback you get as part of a remote viewing exercise, or and sometimes they didn't get feedback directly because these were top secret, you know, assignments, but sometimes they would learn, and Paul Smith has a couple examples of this in his book, where he would learn by accident. He would learn on the news. He would see on the news, oh, that's what I saw. So how do we know that he wasn't simply precognizing that moment? So it's a big debate. I know that Joe McMoneagle, in one of his early books, and I quote him in Time Loops, actually, his originally had a sort of his idea, his mental model of how this worked was exactly what I'm arguing, which is like his future self, when he finds out the truth, is somehow sending a message to his past self, and that's what he's picking up on in a remote viewing session. I don't think that he still thinks that, but that was his original model of how this works.
Let's then assume what you've been working on and thinking about all the time is correct, that this is really our future selves speaking to us now. And let's assume everybody, human beings, learn how to tap into that, but not just tap into that, live that. Would we be human beings anymore? Like, like
Yeah.
would we even exist in 3D? Like, I feel like we would like disappear, so to speak, from physical form. Because if we're connected to our past, present, and future at the same time, what is the need for existing in form?
That is our 4D existence, is our physical existence. I mean, this is, I'm kind of a materialist about, I know that's a bad word these days, and people who study the paranormal, but it's our body, it's our physical body that is our connecting me right now to me tomorrow, it's the same cells, the same, atoms, and so on. It's that those are the world lines that are the wires connecting me across time. And so, it's that material, you know, existence that is the 4D reality. Our consciousness is what's 3D. Our consciousness is what's flat,
Hmm.
but our bodies exist in, you know, in a 4D universe. And it's that material aspect of us that is higher dimensional, honestly, than our consciousness. But as far as what would be human, I think that's a great question, because there's a way in which we are blocked from thinking in these terms, and it has to do with our belief in free will, and that free will is intrinsic to our model of our agency and our just sense of self as beings in the world. It's profoundly challenging to that sense of being a creature with free will to understand there being a future that already exists, and that while your actions contribute to making that future, it nevertheless already exists. It feels like a contradiction.
Hmm.
And we cognitively, I don't know if it's a cultural limitation, and whether we could just, like, if we changed our metaphors and changed the way we understand the self, we could, ascend to to, living this 4D, precognitive life, or whether it's basic to the way our brains operate, that we just really can only think in 3D and really have trouble with the fourth dimension. I don't know what the answer is. I suspect it's the latter. And so I don't know. I'm not super hopeful that we could turn into beings that fully grasp this four dimensionality. I mean, there are models in science fiction for that, right? I mean, there are the film Arrival, for
Mm-hmm.
instance. The heptapods in Arrival live this fully four-dimensional existence in which they clearly don't have a sense of free will, or not in the same way we do. They know what's going to happen 3,000 years in the future. They know that the soldiers are going to, plant a bomb in the ship and going to kill one of them. One of them knows it's going to die, but it's still, there and interact. So, it's very hard to identify or put ourselves
Hmm.
in the mind space of creatures like that. Um, Actually, the heptapods are a lot like the Trifalmadorians in Kurt Vonnegut's book Slaughterhouse-Five.
Okay.
That's his
Never heard.
novel about being unstuck in time, and the aliens. And again, there's these four-dimensional aliens who understand, who live that fourth dimensionality of the universe.
Maybe
But
maybe artists are the closest thing to aliens that we have. Because you said art is prophetic.
sure, yeah. I mean, but even, the thing is that the more, I don't know, I think there is a way that the more you live a precognitive life, the more you are confused. I think a lot of Phil Dick. I mean, he's the classic example. I mean, he's one artist who understood precognition pretty well, and he grasped, especially sort of in the latter part of his life, he grasped that a lot of his experiences were himself communicating with himself across time. I mean, in his exegesis, he gets wild about all kinds of theories, and in his novels, he kind of prefers other kind of more wild Gnostic kind of theories. But he clearly got it that he was precognitive and that he was living a sort of precognitive world. But his life was messed up. I mean, he was messed up and confused, deeply confused, and troubled. I suspect that the more you open this valve, the more confused and fucked up you can get. And so I think there is a value. I think that there's probably a value in keeping that door,
Slightly ajar.
ajar,
Yeah, slightly
slightly ajar.
ajar.
But you open it too much, there are dangers there, and
Yeah,
dangers for your mental health and your
sure.
well-being
No,
and happiness, probably.
I get that.
So I think that that's you got to strike some sort of balance. But yeah, artists and shamans and people are the people who have a pretty wide open door.
Yeah.
But the price is often seen in their
Sure.
lives. They may,
Well, that's the price in the 3D world. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean,
yeah,
we all have to, most of us need to make a living. We have families, we have to feed, we have to educate, and so on and so on. We have to survive physically. I get it.
right.
The state of confusion for me, we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast. It's kind of fun because confusion means that there are no absolutes in your state of mind, right? And not thinking in absolutes is more exciting. That's where imagination can roam a little bit more, and that's where I think you can be. Not I think you can be more creative. Well, here's the question too. One of my last questions here, because I promised you and I were almost there. What is creativity? Small question. Small question.
Well, okay, you can. There are a lot of dimensions to creativity, and a lot of them are cliches at this point. I mean, there's the idea that you have to put a lot of hard work in to be a creative person. There's the Thomas Edison's, it's 99% perspiration, um, and nowadays people who write about creativity are going to emphasize, the fact that the lone genius is a myth, that that we are embedded in social networks and we depend on other people, and that it's a collective enterprise and so on. But I my book is trying to kind of get back to that old idea of inspiration and to kind of revalidate. It feels like it's been debunked. This is how I start the book. I sort of talk about all the books over the last 20 years that have just sort of debunked the idea of inspiration, and they want to talk about neuroscience. They want to talk about how the brain makes new connections and blah blah blah, but it's very uninspiring. and it all presumes that the raw material of creativity is all from the past. We're all taking stuff that already exists and just putting it together in some new way, you know. And I think, very clearly, you can show that creativity is not limited to that. That you know, so much art and literature is truly prophetic in the literal sense that it's talking about events that have not happened yet. It is talking about experiences that have not occurred yet. It is talking about, and that it comes from nowhere. It's not taking pieces and assembling them that you can find lying around. It is receiving something new, and I'm saying that something new is coming from the future. So that there's a real truth to the idea of creativity as novelty, as creating something genuinely, bringing something genuinely new into the world, that is from the future. It's a transmission from the future. So that's,
from
yeah, I think
yourself,
creativity.
from yourself in the future.
Yes, from yourself, but because we are not islands. We communicate.
Hmm.
So like the whole last part of my book, the new book that's coming out, is about artists borrowing from other artists precognitively. So so getting influenced by other, like a critic is going to study artistic influences and literary influences that led to a particular writer or artist. Okay. But you can reverse that and show cases where an artist was clearly being influenced by something they were going to read in their future, and that may hadn't even been written yet or created yet, and that thus artistic influence flows backwards in time, not forwards. So I've got a lot of examples of this, including an example from Phil Dick, an example from David Lynch, Octavia Butler, Franz Kafka. A lot of artists you can clearly see were borrowing ideas from other artists in their future. And so we're not islands. We are influenced. We learn from each other. We're part of a culture. So this is what really interests me, is how you can look at culture both as art, but also culture in the broader anthropological sense of the term, as just, ideas, knowledge, how that may transmit backwards through history via the individual's precognitive imagination. Because if you're precognizing something, that is then precognizing something that is precognizing something, there's a daisy chain of knowledge transmitted into the past.
You believe you're still connected after you die?
I don't know. I'm skeptical. I've not, I don't, my model is, again, I tend to be a materialist about this. I don't know about consciousness. Consciousness, I think, is a big word, and it could mean a lot of things. And maybe the whole universe is conscious. And maybe we dissolve into a larger consciousness when we die. That's perfectly plausible to me. But I think that the information, the informational component of the self, that is to say, our memories, our personality, our experiences, that I just think that's material. That's part of, that's involves, you know, brain processes that, mostly haven't even been studied yet because they're happening, on such a small quantum scale that we can't even study them. But I tend to think that, yeah, the self in that sense probably ends at death. And thus precognition for me in my model, you know, we precognize things up until
Hmm.
our death. And there are very, very few counterexamples to this, or examples of people, plausible examples of people precognizing things after their death. But it's an open debate question, and I'm sure that most of the
Sure.
people you have on your show would probably fiercely debate me on that.
No, that's fine. And it's not about the debate. It's about understanding where, because I ask that question often, maybe not often enough, because it informs me on where you're starting from, I think. Last question for before we sign off. What is greatness to you?
That's a great question. I would say humanity. I'd say, you know, compassion, kindness, care. Those are marks of greatness. And honestly, I see those, in the art that I think really is great. I think the the creator had humanity, you know.
Your reply is actually consistent with something I forgot to talk about or indicate early on in the conversation, and it's a quote in your book. So maybe I'll leave this as my comment to your greatness comment. And it's quite simple, quite short. And you say, "I see the long self revolution as a revolution of imagination and care, of empathy and anti cruelty." That's pretty cool. Eric, thank you, man. So
Thank you.
it
This
was
has been
fun.
fun.
Yeah, I agree. I had more fun than you. How about that?
Oh, I don't think that's possible.
No. Well, we'll see. We'll see what the listener says, but this has been a fun one for sure. We both agree, of course. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.